Nagle Pump, soluciones que fluyen.
All right, so today we're going to be making a video on how to rebuild a 52 power frame for a 7550 or 7600 Gusher vertical series. We've disconnected the power supply of the motor, taken the pump parts off, so now we have this bare power frame. So we're going to take all the nuts and bolts loose from it. You wouldn't have to do this, but it makes it easier to work on. What I would suggest before you do this though is get your cell phone out, take a few pictures of the orientation of all the parts. And I would also suggest to make sure you take care of the threads on the end of the shaft for your impeller. I would keep a nut on there so you don't damage the threads. As you'll see here, that's the impeller nut. So at this point, we're going to pull this shaft assembly out of the power frame. So there you'll see what we call the slider or telescoping bearing housing. You got the bearing cap, radial bearing, grease retainer, and in here, once we get that out, you'll see the thrust bearing. So there's your thrust bearing. Now we're going to have to put this in a vise and take this nut loose. We have a spanner wrench that we use in the plant, but you can also use a chisel. All right, so we took this to a vise and we loosened this nut, what we call a bear hug nut, that holds that thrust bearing in place. And now we're going to move to a press to press these bearings and this whole assembly off. All right, so now we've got this shaft and bearing assembly over to a press, and we're going to press these bearings off. And you see how we've got the slider under the bearing, so you can just press against that. And then we'll move up to the radial bearing and do the same thing with it. And you want to press the bearing and the grease retainer off at the same time. So now we've got this pressed apart. You want to make sure you clean the inside of this. Of course, this is a new one, but when you have a used one, it's going to be full of grease and who knows what. So make sure you clean that. Clean the inside of your bearing housing. And we suggest when you change bearings, you put new lip seals in. You'll see the lip seal here, and you'll want to probably replace that one, and then there's one here you want to replace it. Make sure you get everything clean, keep everything clean as you're putting your new bearings on. And once you get to this point, we have a couple different ways of installing bearings. Here at the plant we have a induction heater that we use because it's much faster, but you can take a piece of pipe or a piece of tubing longer than the shaft, and you can actually drive them on. But if you do that, you want to make sure you only are putting pressure on this inner race, never the outer race. And the same thing for the upper bearing. You'll see we have the steps that we go through. Once we use the induction heater, we get the bearings heated up, and you'll see how that goes back together. So if you purchase a rebuild kit for a 7550 vertical pump, you'll get these parts right here, and you have the thrust bearing, the radial bearing, the grease retainer and radial bearing retainer, the upper lip seal, the lower lip seal, impeller washer, impeller key, impeller nut, and the bear hug nut for the bearing. So now that we have this power frame taken apart and cleaned up and back together, we'll put the new bearings on. So we'll start out with the radial bearing, and then we'll put the grease retainer or bearing retainer. We'll get it on, and then you'll want to slide your slider or telescoping bearing housing on next. And then after that, you'll put your thrust bearing on. We'll have to let it heat up. We heat those to 231 degrees. It's preset. The machine's preset for that. Now we'll put our bear hug nut on, the thrust bearing nut, and we have a spanner wrench that we can tighten that up with. There's other ways to tighten it, but this is the best and cleanest way to do it. And then once we have that tight, we'll take it out of the pipe vise and slide it into the bearing housing. The bearings are going to still be hot, so it's not going to slide right together. You'll have to just wait till they cool or the bearing housing heats up. And once they get to that point, they will slide together. All right, and now that you have the bearing housing slid onto the shaft, you can put your adjustment screws in. You'll have 3 of one length and 3 of another. The longer ones go in the threaded holes of the slider, and then the shorter ones in the through holes that thread into the bearing housing. At that point, you're pretty much finished with it. And then you just reverse the process, put your barrel, your grease fitting, and motor back on, and you should be good to go. So now that you have your power frame reassembled, you have new bearings, lip seals put in it, we're ready to put it back in the pump. And once you get all the pump parts back on it, you want to make sure you go through the steps of adjusting the impeller. To see how to adjust the impeller, you can visit our Ruthman Company's YouTube channel. You can visit Gusher.com to download the full maintenance manual.
Nagle Pump, soluciones que fluyen.